Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming here. Amy, thank you so much for making this night possible. You just heard about me. Again, my name is David Abel, and I am one of the directors at this new center, which has changed names a bit over the years, but we now call it the Center for Media Innovation and Social Impact. Welcome, everyone, to our first live storytelling event. We are so happy to finally have this night and have you all here. Over the past year, our center, which we call Missy, has focused on how we tell stories about climate change that might get through to people, how we might pierce the rampant misinformation and disinformation, and how we present the science in ways that are more likely to be trusted. Tonight, as part of that effort, our fellows and directors will tell their stories about survival, resilience, identity, and memory. In a time of environmental and political upheaval, these are stories that we share. These are stories about what we share, about what we lose, about what we cherish, and how we might create a more just and sustainable future together. I'm going to start by sharing one of those stories. 5 years ago, as a reporter at the Boston Globe, I found myself on an old snub-nosed lobster boat named the Lady Lynn. At the helm was Michael Grimshaw, a beefy man with weary eyes the color of the sea. The 65-year-old captain had named his boat for his ex-wife. He would have changed the name, he told me, but that was considered bad luck. As Grimshaw steered the boat out of Stonington Harbor in Connecticut, his son was preparing a foul-smelling bait in the back of the boat. His former mother-in-law, who was 81, was prepping rubber bands to wrap the lobster's claws. We were chugging through the choppy waters of Long Island Sound when the grizzled captain, his voice raspy from shouting over the diesel engine, told me about the good days of lobstering, when people used to call him the big dog. In the late 90s, Grimshaw competed with hundreds of commercial lobstermen in the Sound for an annual catch that was worth tens of millions of dollars. On a good day, he'd haul up as much as a few thousand pounds of lobster. Michael Grimshaw built a livelihood on filling those traps. He could take his 8 kids on vacations and make them feel that they could have anything they wanted. He also had a legacy to live up to. Grimshaw was from a family of fishermen. He began setting traps before he could drive. He loved to be on the water, to be his own boss, and to gamble that the sea would give back more than his investment in bait, fuel, and maintaining the Lady Lynn. It was a gamble that for many years paid off. But that began to change around the turn of the century, just as temperatures in the Sound began to warm sharply. Since 1982, average annual surface temperatures in the waters between Connecticut and Long Island Sound have warmed about 3 times more than the average of the world's oceans. Even more concerning for fishermen like Michael Grimshaw has been the rise in marine heat waves, which have made Long Island Sound increasingly inhospitable to shellfish and more inviting to predators that have been moving north. Between 1982 and 1992, there were 33 days with heat waves. Between 2015 and 2025, there were 761. That's an increase of more than 2,000%. Lobsters thrive in narrow bands of temperature. When the water exceeds 68 degrees, they're prone to heightened stress that can make it difficult for their shells to grow. Making things worse, fish like black sea bass that typically dwell in the warmer waters of the mid-Atlantic were being found in growing numbers in the Sound, where they feed on juvenile lobsters. All that warming began to catch up with the region's lobster fleet and with Michael Grimshaw. At the peak of their catch in 1998, Grimshaw and other lobstermen working Long Island Sound caught 12.3 million pounds of the crustaceans, which was worth nearly $43 million. By 2024, that had plummeted to 330,000 pounds, earning local lobstermen just $2.4 million. That 97% decline in the catch led to the collapse of the Sound's lobster fleet. By the time I boarded his boat, Michael Grimshaw was believed to be the last full-time lobsterman in Connecticut. The big dog said he now felt more like a puppy. And he told me this: it does something to your ego. On that trip I observed 5 years ago, Grimshaw hauled up one trap after another, more than 100 of them over several hours at sea. He shook his head and he grimaced as his son opened and checked each trap. Some had spider crabs and pogies. Very few had lobsters. In all, they brought back just 25 lobsters that day. Of those, 9 were so damaged that they couldn't be sold, and most of the others looked barely big enough to keep. For Grimshaw, it wasn't that much worse than a typical day at sea. At the time, a good haul amounted to just 50 pounds of lobster, a fraction of what he brought in during the good times. After we arrived back at port, he told me this: it hasn't played out good for us. We're victims of climate change. A few weeks ago, I learned that Grimshaw finally took his last trip to sea just a few months ago as a full-time lobsterman. He now considers himself retired. As the planet warms, there are more and more Michael Grimshaws, those whose lives have changed or are changing in profound ways. Those whose experiences reflect how climate change is no longer some distant abstract threat, but one that very much poses a clear and present danger. Here are a few facts to consider as you listen to tonight's stories. The last 11 years have been the hottest 11 years on record, and this year will almost certainly continue that trend. We're likely to feel that next week when temperatures hit around 90 degrees here in Boston. In 2024, for the first time, global temperatures exceeded the critical threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels for over a full calendar year. And last year, the United States suffered more than $100 billion in damage from weather and climate disasters, reaching that level for the 5th time in the past 6 years. As we head toward a future of a hard-to-fathom 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of this century, many of these depressing facts about climate change too often get lost, misrepresented, or purposely distorted. For those and other reasons, our center, Missy, has been experimenting with different ways to tell these stories through things like academic conferences, studies, films, journalism, and much more. Tonight, our fellows and directors will share their stories about how they've been navigating this warming world. You'll hear from anthropologist Joanna Davidson, photographer Julia Cumes, environmental activist Kanan Tiruvangadam, filmmaker Amy Geller, journalist Mira Subramanian. And to get us started, please welcome to the stage Jalen Carr, who will share a story about her journey from New Orleans to fighting for climate justice. Thank you.
My first instinct was to say no. As a survivor of Hurricane Katrina, it's easy to be a spectacle. Too often, people like me are asked to turn our pain into lessons for others, into entertainment, or to use our trauma to bridge an empathy gap. But I'm not here to recount the worst days of my life for anyone's benefit. What I am here to do is to share what I've learned. I'm here because growing up in a recovering city taught me that environmental policy isn't some abstract debate. It's about who is allowed to come home and who isn't. In post-Katrina New Orleans, I learned that climate isn't just weather. It's how and where cities invest money, it's housing, it's class, it's race. Everyone has seen pictures from Katrina, the Category 5 hurricane that pummeled and obliterated New Orleans in August 2005. About 80% of all structures in Orleans Parish sustained water damage. Over 204,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. More than 800,000 people displaced, and nearly 1,400 killed. These may seem like just numbers to you, but to me, they're the faces of neighbors. They're empty houses on familiar streets. They are a profound loss that is still felt in the city, my city, every single day. My connection to New Orleans goes back at least 5 generations. The women of my family have a strong tradition of social work, community involvement, and connection to our church, Mount Zion Lutheran. In fact, when we go to church, we still sit in the seats that my great-grandmother sat in. We have a long-standing tradition of participating in Zulu, one of the Black carnival groups connected to Mardi Gras. Historically, Mardi Gras had been segregated. Zulu has been an important source of joy, pride, and connection that we have to our city. Separating my family from the city of New Orleans is unimaginable. But when Katrina hit, we had no choice. Katrina wasn't just a natural disaster. The storm itself was natural, but the scale of devastation and who it affected most was certainly not. It was shaped by human decisions, failing levee systems, disinvestment in certain neighborhoods, and long-standing racial and economic inequality, all reinforced by systems that prioritize profit over people. These conditions were built over time through segregation and other social and economic processes that concentrated risk in Black and low-income communities long before the storm ever hit. Communities of color accounted for nearly 80% of the residents in the flooded neighborhoods. Poverty was also concentrated in these areas, with half of the residents living just below or right at the poverty line. Once residents began returning, the recovery process reinforced existing racial inequities. White residents returned to New Orleans at higher rates than Black residents, largely because white neighborhoods received, like Lakeview, recovered faster due to greater access to financial resources, insurance payouts, and political attention. Predominantly Black neighborhoods, like the Ninth Ward, like my own, remained devastated for far longer because residents faced greater barriers to aid. My own family's return to New Orleans coincides with some of my own personal memories of this time. It was an incredibly stressful and disorienting experience. When the levees broke, it forced our family to scatter. I ended up in Texas. I was only 2 years old at the time. I remember many of my family members living together in a FEMA trailer in my great-grandmother's driveway. I remember constantly being reminded of how blessed we were to be alive, to have our family, to live together in safety, and to even have the chance to rebuild. I remember the smell vividly, even years later, walking through the house that my mom grew up in and digging through the debris to find her childhood Barbie dolls. I remember being shown around and using my imagination to fill in the blanks. The bar made of glass blocks, the peach-colored peeling paint on the walls, the molded boxes that once held my family's memories. It wasn't until 2020 that I can honestly say my family felt like we had gotten a sense of normalcy back. My grandmother finally moved back to the city. And for me, it felt great to simply live in a house that I enjoyed coming home to. Not just a house, but a home. My motivation, not only for sharing this story, but also for the work that I do and want to do, comes from the lived understanding that if we don't fix the system, it will keep repeating in other zip codes. Because it already has. We see it in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, where a history of colonial neglect, a fragile power grid, and delayed federal response left millions without electricity or clean water for months. We see it in places like Flint, Michigan, where residents were exposed to lead-contaminated drinking water for years, even after officials knew and chose not to act, prioritizing cost over public health. Different places, different disasters, but the pattern is the same. Vulnerability is constructed over time, long before the crisis hits. The world once watched my city go underwater. So now I am dedicating my life to working with communities like mine in New Orleans and here in Boston to build community-led resilience. Through my work, I've supported both federal and municipal climate programs that help buildings reduce emissions over time, offered pro bono grant support for community-led programs in New Orleans, and created renter-focused resources that make clean energy programs actually accessible to people who don't control their buildings. I've also worked hard to share what I've learned through my access to a private education with the people who need it most. because knowledge is power, and ignorance and misinformation are tools often used to pacify communities and limit their ability to advocate for themselves. We can't count on anyone to save us. We have to save ourselves. And that work starts now, before the next disaster strikes. These ideas are rooted in radical hope. Not the kind of hope that assumes that the system will work, but the kind that emerges when you know it won't and choose to build something anyway. I've seen that hope in families sharing food, water, and information when official systems failed, in communities organizing resources long before the aid arrives, and in people who, despite being failed again and again, still choose to rebuild, to stay in their neighborhoods, and to fight for something better. That kind of hope isn't passive. It's collective. It's built through action, through care, and through a refusal to accept that this is just how things have to be. And yes, I too refuse to accept it. Long before I had the language of environmental justice or climate adaptation, I was just a little Black girl growing up in post-Katrina New Orleans, trying to make sense of why some neighborhoods rebuilt quickly and others didn't, and why the people most affected by disaster seemed to have the least say in what came next. I've noticed that many people in my generation have been pulled into environmental advocacy out of necessity rather than choice. I'm not alone in realizing that the systems we're expected to trust, whether environmental, political, or economic, are breaking down in real time. We've been forced to confront that collapse early and often. And for many of us, advocacy isn't a career path, so much as a survival response. But survival alone isn't the goal. My goal is to change the conditions that make survival this hard in the first place. Thank you.
I'm trying to find a word for what I'm doing. I'm in my parents' house, sorting through piles of my mom's papers, mountains of fabric, endless shelves of photo albums and books and trophies and tchotchkes, closets of clothes and desk drawers filled with random things that someone at some point thought were worth putting in a drawer. I've been here for 10 days doing nothing but this. I open a drawer filled with airline kits, the ones in little cases with flimsy socks and eye masks and tiny tubes of toothpaste. Lufthansa, Virgin Atlantic, Singapore Air. My mom had traveled extensively for her job at the now dissolved USAID. As I rummage, a sock sticking out from a Cathay Pacific kit falls to the floor. And there, peeking out, is a strand of pearls. My mom loved pearls. She wore them almost every day. Sometimes a single choker, sometimes 3 looped strands, sometimes just a pair of studs. She relished finding different kinds of pearls on her travels. Long ropes of Bangladeshi black pearls, peach-colored pearls from China. My mom loved that real pearls are uniquely imperfect, and that they are, or were, alive. These things I'm sorting through are also, in a sense, alive. Alive with story, alive with memory, alive with mystery. This stuff is a kind of afterlife of a person, a family, multiple generations. The treasure and debris of escape, and then stability, of delightful finds and devastating loss. I'm also aware, because of decades of reading and teaching about such things, that objects can be alive in another way, that possessions can be possessed. I'm thinking about the Maori concept of how, the animating spirit residing in an object infused by its owner. How do I know which of these thousands of things is instilled with my mother's how? I'm trying to find a word for what I'm doing. I'm reading letters written not to or by me, deciphering scrawled messages on notepads, unfurling Post-it notes with long forgotten passwords, chuckling over report cards with grades for appropriate posture, riffling through medical records and employment information and paper-sized heartbreaks. What I want to name is the feeling of making a million little decisions about what my mom, my grandma, my brother, all of whom are dead, have left behind, based on some imagined notion of what my children, my eventual grandchildren, perhaps even their grandchildren, might find illuminating. Maybe you're making decisions about your family stuff. Maybe you've already figured out a word for it. For me, going through these things is entangled with my speculations and often my ignorance about the past and future lives of my family. I'm trying to define and divine the value of all this stuff, not just based on utility or marketability or aesthetics. There's something missing from this tick box list that doesn't quite do justice to this task. How do I decide whether to donate or keep a richly embroidered cushion cover I remember my mom buying on one of our trips together? I don't need another cushion cover. My kids probably don't even know from cushion covers. But isn't it the only way they'll know about that trip? About that slice of their grandma's life? My mother died suddenly, unexpectedly, on Mother's Day, 2020. I had just talked to her on the phone, and then wham, a massive brain aneurysm ripped her from our lives. I had no chance to say goodbye, let alone ask what she wanted me to do with her piles of Cambodian silk. The deepest cut is that my children didn't get more time with their grandma, didn't get their fair share of her wisdom, her wry and often judgmental wit, her nourishing heaps of genuine nachas. Losing her makes me acutely aware of my responsibility to find ways that she can still be alive for them, somehow, through the things she touched. Will this folder of knitting patterns she planned to stitch for their birthdays, their bar mitzvahs, or just to keep them warm, give them even the tiniest inkling of how she loved them to pieces, quelled over their very existence? Can I somehow transmit to them even a smidgen of all that through these scraps of her life? Or is this a tenuous and ultimately futile effort to counter the inevitable impermanence of our unbeing? My grandmother bequeathed to me the only 2 items from her Ukrainian home that survived her family's last-minute escape. A tiny silver salt bowl and a bronze cup holder for a glass of samovar brewed tea. Jews of her generation were stripped of their belongings and often of their humanity. Now I am up to my pipik in the exponentially enlarged mass of my parents' possessions. Perhaps this accumulation is a kind of existential victory lap, a way to say, we survived, and now we will collect. But I wonder about the gathering weight of things over a single lifespan and across generations. How its sheer mass seems, on the one hand, to represent stability and success, but its very heaviness constrains a different kind of freedom and mobility than those sought by my displaced grandparents. I'm also wondering about my role in this moment that might be characterized as a lull between successive waves of displacement. I'm making decisions about objects that stand cumulatively for hard-won security, for the possibility that they would be inherited rather than annihilated. But of course, they could all be swept away in one fell swoop, whether by fire or flood or ice. I know, it's just stuff. And there's nowhere to put it all. In my own house, in my descendants' houses, in a world sagging with the weight of our things. I know I'm supposed to donate, to dump, to shed. I'm quite capable of mounting my own manifestos against materialism, consumerism, the deleterious impact of manufactured merchandise on our fragile planet. But as I sit surrounded by all this stuff, I'm grappling with something murkier about this hard-to-name task. When I hold my grandma's tiny silver salt bowl, I am transported to a seat at the huge wooden dining room table in her Ukrainian home, full of aunts and uncles and cousins. On top is the little salt bowl, take a pinch to sprinkle over your slice of challah. The samovar sits in the corner, always ready for tea with piping hot water. I've imagined these scenes, conjured from my grandma's stories of life in a town that no longer exists. The only tactile remainders are these 2 round vessels. Does the samovar cup holder make that evaporated world more real to me? Does it connect me to a place and people I'll never know, but without whom I couldn't exist? Can touching it transport me like a portkey to that almost forgotten time and place? Perhaps I'm pondering the possibility that these things are more than mere objects because I hold tight to the magic of connection through time, across space, mediated by the belongings we touch and carry. As unknowable as we are to each other, as fragile as memories may be, this might be the closest we get to forestalling impermanence, to staving off unbeing. This seemingly mundane task of sorting stuff involves a different kind of work and has different kinds of stakes when connection, not closure, is the holy grail. These things are partial representations of a person, a place, a time, a world. Imperfect pearls with an afterglow of lives lost, and yet somehow present. Can my children come up here for a second? It's your problem now. But I'm still trying to find a word for what I've done. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. 19 years ago, I fell in love with a baby elephant. He was 6 months old. Floods in Assam, India, had separated him from his herd. I was on assignment as a photographer for the International Fund for Animal Welfare, documenting rescue efforts. I learned that baby elephants don't survive without a mother or an aunt or a grandmother. They need family. Every morning, I'd visit him at the Wildlife Rescue Center while he drank his elephant formula from a bottle. He'd stop mid-sip to sniff me, my hair, my shirt, my camera. I'm pretty sure he was evaluating my fashion choices. On my last day, I walked away from the baby elephant's enclosure, and I felt something watching me. He turned around. He pulled himself up on his hind legs, something he'd never done before, just to look out the window. I lifted my camera. There was a lump in my throat. His expression looked human, lonely, searching. I didn't know then that this photograph would follow me for years. How often I would think of his eyes or be asked about his story. 2 years before, I was in New Orleans, a week after Katrina, photographing again for the International Fund for Animal Welfare. I was assigned to follow animal rescue workers. We went house to house in 100-degree heat. The water was still high in places, putrid, oily. I scraped my feet along the pavement as we walked, terrified of disappearing into an open manhole. Inside the homes, life had stopped mid-sentence. Breakfast bowls hardened on tables, toys scattered, mold climbing the walls. People had left thinking they'd return in a day or two. Just a little water is all. When they weren't allowed back, they called hotlines, begging someone, anyone, to find their pets. Sometimes we found them, often we didn't. The ones we did find were sent to a warehouse, grouped by breed, waiting. Owners came, some were reunited, many weren't. I watched people confront the limits of what they had been able to save. That's when something shifted for me. I thought I was documenting environmental disaster, but what I was really documenting was separation, exile, the tearing of bonds. And I kept seeing it in wildfires in California, in floods in Kentucky, in hurricanes in Louisiana, firefighters cradling a burned kitten, a family living out of their car every day, visiting their old cat, Cherish, who'd been found balancing on a dresser, floating in their ruined home. A dog chained beneath a lightning-split tree. Children standing in front of their destroyed trailer, holding up their surviving puppy, the last unbroken thing in their world. Again and again, when everything else is falling away, we reach for who we love. Not clothes, not computers or TVs, not jewelry, who we love. We don't always succeed. A few years after that trip to Assam, India, my orphan elephant photograph was published in a major international magazine, online and in print. And something unexpected happened. Hundreds of people wrote to me, people who'd lost children, lost parents, lost spouses, some to cancer, accidents, war, or just old age. They saw their grief in his eyes. And that's when I began to understand the scale of it. Every disaster is rooted in a particular place, a flooded street, a burned hillside, a single living room. But the story is the same everywhere. Separation, displacement, the breaking of bonds, the before and the after. Before and after. I have my own. When I was 15, my sister and I left apartheid-era South Africa. The country was under a state of emergency, martial law. The regime held a vice-like grip. Just living there meant being part of a system built on inequality and sustained by violence. We couldn't imagine anything was going to change. Leaving felt like the only option. We didn't know it at the time, but we would never again live together as an immediate family under one roof. I remember the airport. There had been bomb threats. The atmosphere was tense. I remember my mother on one side of the security glass, staying, my sister and I on the other, leaving. We all pressed our hands against it, but our fingers could no longer touch, even though we were inches apart. We wouldn't all live together in the same country for 2 more years. By that point, my sister and I were both out of the house. Our childhood was over. That moment at the airport was when our family split into before and after. I didn't have the language for it then, but I know it now. I recognize rupture when I see it. In my family's case, it wasn't a flood or a fire that split us. It was politics, power, a man-made system. But rupture is rupture. The cause changes. I'm not sure the feeling does. For years, I thought I was photographing animals in disasters, but the animals were never the whole story. They were evidence of attachment, evidence of who we refuse to leave behind, evidence of who we were just yesterday, or last week, or last year. Evidence of these moments in time we will never, can never return to. We tend to talk about climate change in numbers, degrees, percentages, charts. I've seen it measured differently, in absence, in separation. And sometimes I see it in a baby elephant standing on his hind legs, just trying to get a glimpse of who is leaving and who is already gone. Thank you.
Go with the flow. Let the land decide. My mom tells me this in our backyard garden while I make little canals with my little hands so the well water can reach the plants. I'm 6 years old. My mom and I are at our house in a small southern Indian town. She's fetching the water from the well and pouring it into the corner of the garden closest to the well. And it's my job to make sure that water reaches all the plants. It's one of my favorite and vivid memories of my childhood. My hands in the dirt, learning to make things grow. And then, not too long after that, another memory, a darker one. I smell the sweet aroma of the jasmine that my mother's body is decorated with. I feel the heat emanating from the pot of ember that my brother is carrying. We are in a funeral procession. At 12, I lost the person who brought me into this world. I lost my source of nourishment and resilience. I went everywhere she went, to the farm, to the shops, and to visit relatives. When I wasn't in school, I was with her. Without her, I was lost. The grief stuck day after day, month after month, year after year. I sulked and sulked until one day when I noticed my father and grandmother working very hard to make up for the loss. I thought, I don't want to lose them too, but I will. It occurred to me that the only way to cope with losing loved ones, to avoid any regret, is to cherish and honor them while they are still alive. I vowed to do just that. Years later, I was sitting at Bard College at a conference about how to build a greener, more sustainable economy. Writer and activist Bill McKibben described what felt to me like the end of the world. Loss of biodiversity, the sixth mass extinction on our planet, hurricanes, droughts, on and on. The grief and shock from losing my mother came rushing back into me. The emotional defenses that I had built subconsciously were shattered. I was shaken to my core at the thought of losing another mother, Mother Earth. I was pretty freaked out by what I heard. I decided I needed to do something about it to fulfill the vow I had made when I was younger, to cherish and honor loved ones while they're still alive. So I signed up for 2 courses, one about the causes and consequences of climate change, and the other analyzing it from several perspectives: economic, social, environmental, and political. I was amused by the way Professor Archer explained it. Some gases trap heat because they resonate with infrared radiation. Carbon dioxide, for example. He held his hands, oxygen atoms, and shook his head, carbon atom, like a trained Indian dancer. I got even more involved. I started going to protests. There was a high-pressure gas pipeline coming to West Roxbury, to a part of the neighborhood with 5 schools and 1 active quarry, dangerous in the present and dangerous in the future. It seemed bonkers to me that we would want to build a pipeline to carry poison into our communities like this. Yet, we did exactly that. I thought in a progressive state like Massachusetts, in a city like Boston, this would be stopped. Thousands protested. Hundreds got arrested. That's me in the safety vest. The pipeline came anyway. That's when I realized maybe there's something much bigger in action here. As a naive immigrant, it took me a while to figure out something you probably already knew. It's money in politics, which was made worse by the Citizens United ruling. So I joined an organization called Move to Amend to communicate to our government that when we say people, we don't mean corporations. And when we say freedom of expression, we don't mean the ability to spend lots and lots of money. I started learning more about politics, and I realized if the parties are to be reformed, we have to join them. I have to join them. The activists say, if not you, who? I guess I took it to heart. I ran for the Democratic Ward Committee and State Committee and got elected. But all of this, the environmental classes, the protests, the activism, and political organizing, it didn't feel enough. I was getting tired and impatient. I did not feel like I was keeping my vow. I started to look for a more tangible way to take action. In 2015, I took a course in permaculture, which is regenerative agriculture. That's when my neighbor Monica, who ran a vegetarian restaurant in East Boston, and I came across this abandoned city-owned lot close to Maverick Tea Station. People had been throwing trash in it. It was full of weeds. Monica and I applied for a temporary permit from the city to enter the lot, clean it up, and engage the community in growing plants. It worked. The city gave us a permit in 2015. The trouble was, they only gave it to us in August, and the permit expired at the end of the calendar year. So, as soon as we finished cleaning up the place and planted some cool weather crops, we planted garlic. When the temporary permit ran out, the city wanted us out because the period of the permit ended. You've had your fun, they said. And we said, no, we haven't. We planted garlic. We have to harvest it and can't until next summer. You did what? Said the city person. Luckily for us, they hadn't made any other plans for the land, so they gave us another year's permit. This time, we had a whole growing season ahead of us. We hosted a Wake Up the Earth festival and called it Tierra Bella. We celebrated solstices and equinoxes. We planted more garlic. The next year, we got another permit extension and then another. Finally, in 2018, the city began a public process to convey the land, which allowed us to take ownership of it. And in order to take ownership, we had to form an entity. And the entity needed a name. I recalled how when I first moved to East Boston, my friends who lived there called it Eastie. And voila, Eastie Farm was born. Once we got ownership of the land, we planted trees, peach, persimmon, and pear. We set up safe pathways, and we built a pocket park, which became a food distribution site in East Boston during COVID. We distributed over 5,000 hot meals every week during the height of the pandemic. Today, kids come to play and learn as they play, even if they don't always know that they're learning. Young adults come for workshops on recycling, composting, and planting. They also come to play. Older folks come to grow food and to be with other people. And yes, also to play music. Me, I love hanging out in that space. When it rains, I like to go and watch the storm water flow. I direct the water a little here and a little there. After all, it's my job to make sure the water reaches all the plants, just like when I was a kid back in India. Sometimes when my hands are working in the dirt, I can hear my mother's voice. Go with the flow, she says. Let the land decide. And I listen. Thank you.
I want to tell you about a little girl who grew up on the beach. Hampton Beach, part of the tiny New Hampshire seacoast. A girl who built sandcastles and played with her sisters in the freezing waves while their mother read Danielle Steele on a beach towel. A girl whose blue-collar family fit right in at the mini golf course, the Penny Arcade, and at the crown jewel of them all, perhaps the most beautiful piece of architecture ever conceived, the Hampton Beach Casino. At 16, I got a job bussing tables and waitressing at the Whale's Tail restaurant inside the casino. Picture a dark, musty interior, with maritime decor like ship helms and lobster traps. For 5 summers, I served fish and chips and prime rib to blue-collar families like mine, from places like Lawrence and Lowell, and to French Canadians from Quebec. I made friends with other waitresses like Ellen and Jonalyn, who were much wilder than I was. Ellen was the cool rebel who smoked Camel cigarettes in the parking lot behind the restaurant. I'm in the middle there, by the way. Jonalyn was the life of the party. Her boyfriend bought us Natty Ice, the cheapest and crappiest beer around. Just to give you some context, Bud Light was actually too highbrow for my crowd. I fell in love with a line cook named Hobart. He was an actor with piercing blue eyes who recited Chekhov behind the friar-later. Sadly, Hobart did not fall in love with me. Though I did get to see Taylor Dane, Gloria Estefan, Pat Benatar, and the Monkees perform at the Hampton Beach Casino Ballroom. It was a formative time in my life. Hampton Beach felt like the center of the universe. But not all the Hampton townies shared my affection for it. To some, Hampton Beach was a trashy outpost, a place invaded by rowdy tourists looking for a cheap getaway from their industrial cities in Massachusetts. But my parents and relatives had been raised in those cities, like Lynn and Peabody and Fall River, to be exact. When you grow up working class in a cramped 1950s Cape house with paper-thin walls and only one bathroom, the beach and the casino were like summer living rooms, familiar, comfortable, ours. And then everything changed. I went away to an elite college in Maine, surrounded by moneyed, privileged students. Hampton Beach quickly lost its glamour. I became ashamed of every blue-collar thing about it. Maybe those townies had been right. Maybe it was trashy. So I started keeping my distance, literally and emotionally. After college, I moved away to the Boston area, where I gradually became a creative producer and a documentary filmmaker. I continued to visit Hampton Beach because my mom, now divorced from my dad, still lived there. But it was more out of obligation. I was being the dutiful daughter. I had actually lost all desire to visit the beach or the casino. I didn't belong there anymore. I would often race back to Boston as quickly as possible. While I was away, Hampton Beach started changing too. It's been the target of a massive redevelopment effort initiated by the state of New Hampshire. Private residential investment has followed. Seasonal cabins turned into luxury condo complexes. Family-owned motels were replaced with high-end hotels. But it's not just man-made change that is visiting Hampton Beach. It's bigger than that, more existential. Parts of Hampton Beach Casino have already been condemned due to water damage from coastal flooding. With global warming, rising sea levels, more severe storms, and more coastal flooding are inevitable. So I'm not sure this place will even be standing in 20 years. Every year feels like borrowed time. And here's the thing, I feel the threat of this loss, the prospect of it, really deeply. You see, in the last few years, my attitude has undergone a sea change. There was a time when I was embarrassed by my uneducated mother, who worked as a lunch lady in a Hampton elementary school. But I've grown to cherish everything blue-collar about her, like the way she'd keep the house freezing to save on the heating bill, or how she faithfully clipped supermarket coupons every Sunday. Beyond just my family, I've come to value Hampton Beach and the Hampton Beach Casino for the working class havens they are. In fact, I've come to value them so much that I've started working on a documentary about them before it's too late. About a year ago, I learned that the town of Hampton had approved a proposal by a real estate developer to tear down and rebuild the Hampton Beach Casino. The plan is to replace it with a gala complex that includes an expanded music venue, a large gambling facility, a boutique hotel, and high-priced condos. The developer says that, yes, of course, we're going to build this thing with coastal flooding in mind. But I have to wonder, how do they really know? How do any of us really know? Last summer, I brought a filmmaking friend to check out the current casino. I was trying to persuade her to join my documentary project, so I tried to really sell her on how special this place was. "That building?" she exclaimed. "It's an eyesore." Exactly, I thought. Isn't it spectacular? Many of us have places like this in our lives. Places that formed us, made us. While change is inevitable, what is lost and what's the price of that change? It's something I've been thinking a lot about lately, especially since I lost my mom to cancer in 2021. I guess this is what nostalgia feels like. At a time when the world is so complex and overwhelming, couldn't we just go back to fried clams and taffy? What I can say for sure is that there's a sadness in knowing that this place, my place, Hampton Beach, whether through redevelopment or rising seas, is changing forever. As I tell you this story, I don't know what will become of Hampton Beach or its casino, or how much longer they will still be around. I don't even know yet what my film will be about. What I do know is that all these years later, that little girl is still in me, playing in the frigid water, building sandcastles. And so is the teenager, slinging fish and chips in a ragged old building where hardworking people got a little taste of leisure and respite. Thank you.
I want to bring you to a kitchen table conversation I had One afternoon in North Dakota, in a county called Divide. It was 2018. I was a half-brown journalist with East Coast plates on her Subaru and a long, weird last name. I'd been invited to the home of a cattle rancher named Byron Carter. Gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled onto his land close to the Canadian border. His wife wasn't there, or his kids, just Byron and his dogs. By way of greeting, he told me he'd invited a bunch of his rancher friends to come meet me. My skin prickled. What have I gotten myself into? Was I really doing this again? At this point, I'd been a freelance journalist covering the environment for years. Stories had taken me to Rajasthan, India, where I missed my train stop in the middle of the night and had to double back. To Delhi, where auto rickshaw drivers took shortcuts down darkened alleys. And to Nairobi, where I worked from a cafe that was later targeted by terrorists. Now here I was, alone, in Byron's house in remote North Dakota, hoping my run of luck would continue. 7 men filed into his house, big guys. They kicked off their work boots and entered the kitchen in stockinged feet, shook my hand hello, and accepted cups of coffee from Byron. The pinpricks settled. I was going to be okay. I was there. I had chosen to be there at a time of growing division and fear in the United States. The 2016 election had laid bare how polarized we were. Left and right, red and blue, so much rage at the poles of the political spectrum. It seemed like there was no room for the middle. I had pointed my blue Subaru to the reddest of the red. My hope was to cross over what sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild has called the empathy wall. I wanted to write stories exploring how people in these communities felt and understood climate change, how it affected their lives, where they put the blame. So I went to Georgia, where the peach harvest failed because the winter was too warm to set the fruit. And to Wisconsin, where dog sledders had to rely on wheels because they could no longer depend on winter snows. There in Divide County, in 2017, drought had ravaged the plains. Ranchers like Byron, who depend on rain to grow the grain and fill the water tanks for their herds, were really hard hit. In Byron's kitchen, I asked these ranchers about their lives and values, what they believe in, who they vote for, and why. I asked them what they remember of their land from before and what they expected in the future. In a time of climate change, those things have never felt more different. Here's what they told me. They now measured rain in tenths of an inch. They couldn't afford to truck in hay when the whole region had been hit. They sold off cattle at pennies to the dollar. They also told me that climate change was not the cause. They'd thrown global warming out the window when the spring had been bitter cold, after all. And they'd seen this before. There was that bad drought back in the 80s, you know. They also admitted they were one drought away from liquidation. These men, I could tell, they took care of each other. If they got caught in a ditch, these were the neighbors they called for help. these middle-aged bachelors in their socks in Byron's kitchen. One rancher named Jim brought the conversation back to New York City, where I had mentioned having once lived. He told me he'd been thinking about that city just the other day, in the middle of calving season. I had a cow in the chute, and we were going to pull a calf, he said. And I was right behind, eyeball to asshole, another rancher interjected. Jim nodded, continued. And well, it was time for her to go to the bathroom, and I ducked. I saw it coming, but I got a shot down the neck and the back of my head, and I was thinking, I wonder if these frickin' New Yorkers know just what we do to get that steak on the table. Everyone in the room agreed. I found myself nodding too. As I sat with the men, I felt myself stuck on the top of the empathy wall. So much separated us. Geography, politics, gender, ethnicity, alarm or dismissal about climate change. But there were things we shared. Before moving to the East Coast, I'd lived on a farm in rural Oregon. Sitting there in Byron's kitchen, I remembered the ditches I had dug in the middle of the night, in the dark, in the rain, with the friends who made up my community. I remembered the sweet stench of slaughter, our hands in the blood, the bountiful bowls of fresh greens we'd grown from seed, and the disappointment when a crop failed. It was in the woods of Oregon that I realized the political spectrum is not a spectrum at all. Earth firsters and homeschooled Christians overlapped here and diverged there. You never knew who might own a gun or believe in God. But you knew everyone loved the land, depended on the land below our feet. It's pretty tough to find anybody besides a farmer rancher that loves Mother Earth as much as we do, Byron told me in his kitchen. And yet, the ranchers, the peach farmers, the dog sledders, so many of them had voted for a man seemingly dead set on making the extreme weather more extreme. They did it in 2016 and again in 2024. That kitchen table conversation in Divide County happened 8 years ago. 8 long years ago. Back then, I allowed myself to wonder if the extreme weather events could unite us, everybody, everywhere, as we wrestle with what is truly a global crisis. The droughts, the dying cattle, the withered peaches, the Montana streams closed to fly fishers, the West Virginia townspeople who lost their neighbors to the flood. Back then, I figured we were all experiencing solastalgia, the term eco-philosopher Glenn Albrecht coined to describe missing one's own territory when it becomes ecologically unrecognizable. Back then, I imagined that solastalgia could be the shared lament between the climate-stubborn right and the Green New Deal left. The latter we could use to get us over the empathy wall. After all, everyone depends on the rainfall that nourishes our crops. We all want joy and sustenance. And who doesn't love a ripe, juicy peach? I admit that in the years since, I have wondered if we're already in the ditch, all of us, and there's no one left to call. Yet I will stand on this very stage in 2 weeks talking about my new book. It's called better world is possible. Note, it's not called a better world is probable. But it is possible. I hold on to hope. Stubborn, maybe naive, maybe delusional. I believe in a better world not because the belief is rational, but because to not believe feels unimaginable. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. We are incredibly grateful for your support and helping us build a community around our new center, Missy. I want to end tonight with a few thank yous. First, I want to invite all our storytellers back up onto the stage. Please give them all another round of applause. Thank you. All right. From the bottom of my heart, thank you, Jalen, Joanna, Julia, Kanan, Amy, and Mira, for having the courage to share your stories, for the work that each of you do, and for giving meaning to the word we have been using for the past year, fellowship. I want to also say a deep thanks to the amazing team here at CitySpace, Amy McDonald, Stephen Davey, and Chris Barrios. You have provided invaluable support and made tonight feel seamless. All of us at Missy are deeply grateful to Dean Mariette DiChristina and some of the others at our College of Communication for your foresight and your persistence in bringing this center into the world. Thank you so much. Our director, Eric Gordon, has been a great confidant, a source of wisdom, and a staunch supporter over the past few months. Tonight would not have been possible without your leadership. Thank you so much. I also want to thank everyone else at Missy who played a crucial role in pulling tonight together. Our other directors, Chris Wells, I think you're in the audience somewhere, and Amy Geller again. Our programs manager, Sharon Wong. Where are you, Sharon? Thank you. And the many students, incredibly talented students who created the graphics and helped in so many ways. Janice Bonilla, Joseph Chirinos, Hannah Lay, Anna McLean, Baria Mustafa, and Sofia Sanchez. Thank you so much. And finally, there is one person more than anyone else we have to thank tonight for making this happen. When we first thought about who might direct an event like this, there was one person I couldn't imagine pulling this off without, Scott Hellman. who is in the back. Scott, you heard from Amy McDonald at the top, is a former colleague of mine at the Boston Globe, and he's now a professor at BC. He also spent years directing, as you heard, similar shows, which we used to call Globe Live at the Globe. Over the past few months, Scott has vetted nearly every word you heard tonight and overseen the smallest of details. He's been a wise editor, a clear-eyed director, and a good Zen-minded friend. Scott, come on up. Thank you. I can't see anything. Before we end, I just wanted to give Eric Gordon an opportunity to just say thank you and to thank you on the part of all of us, but to give a few final words tonight. Please invite Eric Gordon up to the stage.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thanks for all of you for an extraordinary evening. David he told me very, very clearly, don't prepare anything, because he was afraid I was going to make a 90-minute speech tonight, but I'm not going to do that. I just want to say, just from the bottom of my heart, how what is so clear to me is that a story is worth 1,000 data points. And what we see, and this is the mission of our center, that we're deeply committed to communicating the impacts of climate, communicating the details of science and scholarship in a way that's clear to people and accessible, and most importantly, trustworthy. And we're exploring all sorts of different ways of doing that. One of them is through story and through visuals and through art. And our center is committed to the partnership between science and story and art. And that's what we stand for, and that's what this fellowship is. And I just want to thank a few other people. We're not going to go through a bunch of names, but I want to ask the other fellows in the room. We actually have 15 fellows. You only heard from 4 of them tonight. Could the other fellows stand up, please, who are the fellows who have been part of our community and have been so important to this entire process? So thank you all for being here. We have a book outside that includes all the stories that you heard tonight, plus the stories from the other fellows who were not on stage tonight. And it's broken up into 2 categories, the stories written for the page and the stories written for the stage. And so we do hope that you take a look at that. And if the book is out there, we're asking for a small donation for the book, but also just sign up for our mailing list, and we'll share the digital copy of that so you'll be able to take these stories home with you. So again, thank you so much for coming out, and thanks again for our incredible cast tonight. Have a great night.